The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time didn't just succeed, it fundamentally changed what video games could be. Released in November 1998 for the Nintendo 64, this wasn't merely another sequel in a beloved franchise. It was a revolutionary leap that transformed gaming's entire landscape, establishing design principles that define 3D action-adventure games to this day. With over 7.6 million copies sold on N64 alone, and a Metacritic score that remains the highest-rated game in history 27 years later, Ocarina of Time stands as both a commercial triumph and an artistic masterpiece whose influence echoes through every modern action game. But here's what makes this story remarkable. Ocarina of Time achieved this legendary status while launching on hardware that sold only 33 million units, a fraction of the NES or SNES install base. It earned $150 million in the US in just 39 days, outgrossing Hollywood blockbusters. It received more perfect scores than any game before or since, and perhaps most significantly, it gave us the blueprint for 3D gaming that developers still follow today. From Dark Souls to Red Dead Redemption, from God of War to The Witcher, the DNA of Ocarina of Time courses through modern gaming's veins. Today, we're examining why Ocarina of Time isn't just remembered fondly, but actively shapes how games are designed nearly 3 decades later. This isn't nostalgia or rose-tinted retrospection. This is understanding how one game became gaming's equivalent to The Godfather or Citizen Kane, a work so influential that it split the medium's history into before and after. Let's explore what made Ocarina of Time a once-in-a-generation achievement that transcends its own excellence to become foundational to an entire art form. The impossible challenge, bringing Zelda to 3D. To understand Ocarina of Time's achievement, you need to understand what Nintendo faced. In 1998, 3D gaming was uncharted territory. Super Mario 64 had proven 3D could work for platformers, but action-adventure games, with their emphasis on combat, exploration, puzzle-solving, and narrative, presented unique challenges. How do you create engaging sword combat when players struggle with camera control? How do you design puzzles in 3 dimensions? How do you maintain the sense of discovery that defined 2D Zelda in a 3D space? The industry was watching. A Link to the Past had established Zelda as Nintendo's premier adventure franchise, but translating that formula into 3D seemed impossible. Early 3D games struggled with clunky controls, disorienting cameras, and shallow combat that devolved into button-mashing chaos. Many developers believed certain genres simply couldn't work in 3D, that the added dimension created too many problems to solve elegantly. Nintendo not only solved these problems, they solved them so thoroughly that their solutions became industry standards. The game was in development for years, delayed repeatedly as the team wrestled with fundamental design questions. Director Shigeru Miyamoto insisted on getting it right rather than rushing to meet deadlines. The team experimented, prototyped, and refined until every system worked perfectly together. The pressure was immense. This was Nintendo's flagship franchise making its 3D debut. Failure would be catastrophic, not just for Zelda, but for Nintendo's entire N64 strategy. The game needed to prove that 3D adventure games could match or exceed their 2D predecessors, that adding a dimension enhanced rather than compromised gameplay. It needed to sell consoles and justify the N64's existence against Sony's PlayStation. What they delivered exceeded every expectation. Ocarina of Time didn't just work in 3D. It proved that 3D was the future. It showed that games could be cinematic without sacrificing interactivity, expansive without feeling empty, complex without being confusing. The transition was so successful that returning to 2D Zelda felt like regression rather than tradition. Z-targeting, the innovation that changed everything. If Ocarina of Time had contributed nothing else to gaming, Z-targeting alone would secure its legacy. This single mechanic, pressing Z to lock onto enemies, solved 3D combat's fundamental problem and became so ubiquitous that modern gamers barely notice it. But in 1998, it was revolutionary. The difference between 3D combat being frustrating chaos and engaging strategic gameplay. Before Z-targeting, 3D action games suffered from a critical flaw. You couldn't reliably face your enemies. Camera angles shifted unpredictably, enemies moved faster than you could adjust perspective, and attempting to fight multiple foes descended into disorienting mess. Players spent more time wrestling with cameras than engaging with combat. Games tried various solutions, all inadequate. Fixed cameras like Resident Evil created blind spots, automatic cameras made unpredictable choices, and manual camera control demanded constant attention. Z-targeting was elegant genius. Press Z and Link locks onto the nearest enemy. The camera automatically positions itself to keep both Link and the target visible. You circle Strife while maintaining focus, react to attacks without losing sight of threats, and switch targets with a button press. Combat became tactical rather than chaotic. You chose when to engage, how to approach, when to defend or attack. But Z-targeting's brilliance extends beyond combat. It also targeted NPCs for conversations, objects for interaction, and environmental elements for context-sensitive actions. It unified the interface, making everything intuitive. The Z button became your pay attention to this button, streamlining interaction without cluttering the screen with UI elements or requiring complex button combinations. The impact is incalculable. Dark Souls' lock-on system? Ocarina. God of War's targeting? Ocarina. The Witcher 3's focus mechanics? Ocarina. Elden Ring's combat? Built entirely on principles Ocarina established. Former Rockstar Games executive Dan Houser stated, "Anyone who makes 3D games who says they've not borrowed something from Mario or Zelda is lying." Z-targeting is what they borrowed. The foundation beneath modern action gameplay. The mechanic was so perfectly designed in 1998 that it barely needed refinement. Games since have added features, target switching options, soft versus hard locks, targeting priorities, but the core concept remains identical to Ocarina's implementation. That's remarkable. Most innovations need years of iteration across multiple titles before reaching maturity. Z-targeting emerged fully formed, a complete solution on the first attempt.
Context-sensitive controls, elegance through simplicity. Z-targeting gets the attention, but Ocarina of Time's context-sensitive button system was equally revolutionary. The A button performed different actions depending on context: talk to NPCs, open doors, climb ledges, roll, pick up objects, read signs. Instead of memorizing separate buttons for each action, players pressed A whenever they wanted to interact. The game determined appropriate action based on situation. This eliminated a major barrier to 3D gaming. Previous games overwhelmed players with button combinations: hold this, press that, tap these simultaneously. Ocarina streamlined everything. The HUD displayed what A would do in any situation: talk, open, climb, grab. Players always knew their options without remembering complex control schemes or experimenting with every button. The system reduced cognitive load, letting players focus on experiencing the world rather than managing controls. When you approached a ladder, you didn't wonder which button climbed it, you saw climb appear and pressed A. When an NPC had information, talk appeared. The game communicated through interface rather than requiring memorization. This approach influenced game design far beyond Zelda. Modern games universally adopt context-sensitive controls. One button for multiple actions, UI prompts indicating functionality, simplified interfaces that adapt to situation. We take this for granted now, assuming it's obvious design, but in 1998, it was innovative thinking that prioritized player experience over control scheme complexity. The elegance extended to item usage. C-button items appeared on HUD corners, visible at all times. You never forgot which items were equipped, never navigated buried menus during combat. This always accessible, always visible philosophy became standard because it works perfectly. Players should never lose track of their tools or struggle to use them when needed. Creating Hyrule, the world as character. Ocarina of Time's Hyrule felt alive in ways that were unprecedented for 1998. The day-night cycle changed more than lighting. It transformed behavior. NPCs followed routines, appearing in different locations at different times. Shops opened and closed. Certain enemies only emerged at night. Hyrule Field felt dangerous after dark when stall children rose from the ground, safe during daylight when merchants traveled the roads. This created a world that existed beyond player actions. Things happened whether you participated or not. The world had its own rhythms and routines independent of your presence. This illusion of life, that Hyrule would continue existing even if you stopped playing, made the setting feel real rather than staged. Weather systems added another layer. Rain altered atmosphere and gameplay. Time passage affected environmental states, frozen lakes in winter, flowing in summer. These weren't just aesthetic choices, they impacted gameplay. Certain areas were only accessible at specific times. Some puzzles required manipulating time. The Ocarina's time travel songs integrated world state into puzzle design brilliantly. The transition between child and adult Link amplified this. Return to locations as adult Link, and they've changed. Hyrule Castletown becomes ominous and dangerous. Like Hylia's water level drops. Characters age and evolve. This wasn't just different textures. It was narrative environmental storytelling showing consequences of time passage and Ganondorf's corruption spreading through Hyrule. Size contributed to immersion. Hyrule Field felt vast and expansive, especially by 1998 standards. The scale created genuine exploration, where destinations weren't just screen transitions, but actual journeys across meaningful space. Getting opponent transformed travel, making the world feel even larger when you could finally traverse it quickly. That sense of scale, that Hyrule was a real place with distance and geography, set standards for open-world design that influenced games for decades. Music as gameplay, the Ocarina's genius. Using music as a core gameplay mechanic was unprecedented and brilliant. The Ocarina wasn't just a story device or atmospheric element, it was Link's primary tool for manipulating the world. Songs changed time of day, teleported you across Hyrule, summoned rain, opened doors, and revealed secrets. Music had tangible gameplay function integrated seamlessly into adventure design. The button layout enhanced this. The N64 controller's C buttons corresponded to ocarina holes. Playing songs meant actually pressing the notes in sequence, creating physical connection between player and instrument. This wasn't watching a cutscene of Link playing, you were playing, executing the melody yourself. The haptic feedback of button presses matched the fiction of Link pressing ocarina holes. Learning songs felt meaningful. Each represented power and possibility. Learning Zelda's Lullaby meant accessing royal secrets. Learning the Song of Storms meant manipulating weather. Songs weren't just keys for locks. They were expressions of Link's growing connection to Hyrule's magic and history. The act of learning from teachers positioned music as inherited wisdom, ancient knowledge passed down through generations. Koji Kondo's soundtrack elevated everything. The limited 5-note scale forced creativity, resulting in distinct, memorable melodies despite constraints. Seria's sound remains instantly recognizable. The Song of Time's haunting notes evoked the game's themes perfectly. Each dungeon theme established atmosphere and identity. The music wasn't background, it was integral to experience and emotional impact. The Ocarina's influence extended beyond gaming. Ocarina sales increased dramatically after the game's release. People wanted real instruments to play real songs. The game popularized an ancient wind instrument that had been largely forgotten, creating cultural impact beyond the medium. How many games can claim they revived interest in actual musical instruments? Dungeons as puzzle masterclasses. Ocarina of Time's dungeons represent peak puzzle and level design. Each dungeon had distinct identity, visual theme, unique mechanics, specific emotional atmosphere. The Forest Temple's twisted corridors and haunting music created unease. The Fire Temple's oppressive heat and lava hazards emphasized danger. The Water Temple's infamous complexity challenged spatial reasoning and patience. Dungeons taught you their languages gradually. Early rooms introduced mechanics simply. Mid-dungeon challenges combined those mechanics in complex ways. Boss fights tested mastery of dungeon-specific concepts. This progressive education never felt like tutorialization, it felt like natural exploration and discovery, with complexity emerging organically from experimentation. The small key and boss key system created satisfying progression loops. Finding keys felt rewarding, opening new areas drove exploration forward, and acquiring the boss key signaled approaching climax. Dungeons were perfectly paced journeys with clear narrative arcs. Enter as an explorer, become increasingly competent, ultimately face the challenge you've been preparing for.
Puzzles integrated seamlessly into architecture. Switches weren't arbitrary, they fit thematically into environments. Block-pushing puzzles in ancient temples made sense contextually. Lighting torches in the Fire Temple felt appropriate. The hookshot's function emerged naturally from dungeon design rather than feeling like arbitrary use this tool here moments. Zelda's puzzle design philosophy. Tools serve environmental interaction, not arbitrary challenge creation, became the model for adventure games. The dungeons also told environmental stories. The forest temple was clearly an ancient structure reclaimed by nature. The spirit temple's split design, child and adult sections requiring time travel, brilliantly integrated narrative and gameplay. The shadow temple's darkness and horror elements created unsettling atmosphere. Dungeons weren't just challenge gauntlets, they were places with history and purpose that contextualized why you were there. The time travel narrative, growing up in game form. Ocarina of Time's 7-year time jump, where Link draws the Master Sword and awakens as an adult, remains one of gaming's most impactful narrative moments. You're not just witnessing story development, you're experiencing the loss of childhood, the burden of responsibility, and the consequences of time passage. Link loses 7 years sleeping in the Sacred Realm, while Ganondorf corrupts Hyrule. When you wake, everything has changed. This wasn't just narrative, it was emotional storytelling through environmental design. Hyrule Castletown, once bustling and safe, becomes a ghost-infested ruin. The Lost Woods' familiarity becomes tragic when Saria is gone. Even reunions are bittersweet. People don't recognize you, they've aged while you haven't, relationships are frozen while the world moved on. The game captured the specific melancholy of returning home after long absence to find everything different. The dual timeline structure created fascinating gameplay and narrative depth. Puzzles required child Link to access certain areas, adult Link for others. You learned information as a child that became relevant years later as an adult. The world state depended on which time period you inhabited. This wasn't gimmick, it was integrated design that made time travel mechanically meaningful while reinforcing narrative themes about consequence and change. Link's character development through this split was masterful. Child Link is playful, curious, fitting naturally into the Kokiri forest. Adult Link is burdened by destiny, isolated by responsibility. The game never explicitly states this. It's communicated through character interactions, world state, and the contrast between the innocent journey's beginning and the weight of its conclusion. The ending reinforced these themes. Link returns to his child form, but the player remembers the journey he took, the adult he became, the relationships forged and lost. It's bittersweet. Link prevented catastrophe but sacrificed the future he briefly lived. Few games end with such emotionally complex notes, acknowledging that even victories have costs, and growing up means gaining and losing simultaneously. Visual storytelling and cinematic direction. While graphically surpassed by modern standards, Ocarina of Time's cinematic direction remains exemplary. Nintendo used 3D space to create compositionally powerful scenes that communicated through framing and perspective rather than dialogue. Link pulling the Master Sword from its pedestal isn't just pressing a button, it's a carefully choreographed sequence that communicates the weight of that moment through camera work, music, and timing. The game understood when to show and when to let players experience. Cutscenes were brief, purposeful, always contextual to player actions. You weren't watching a movie interrupted by gameplay, you were playing a game enhanced by cinematic moments. The balance respected player agency while delivering impactful storytelling. Character expressions, despite technical limitations, conveyed emotion effectively. Zelda's desperation when sending Link back in time, Ganondorf's menacing presence even in early encounters, Navi's concern for Link, these registered emotionally despite primitive facial animation. Nintendo compensated for technical constraints with strong direction, using body language, framing, and context to communicate what graphics couldn't render. The final confrontation with Ganondorf exemplifies this. The build-up, climbing Ganon's tower, the music's intensity, Zelda's capture creates anticipation through pacing. The transformation of Ganondorf into Ganon is a stunning moment of horror and spectacle. The final blow, with Zelda and the sages sealing Ganon away, provides cathartic closure with appropriate ceremony. This wasn't just defeat the boss, it was a narrative climax that felt earned and appropriately epic. Commercial success in context. Ocarina of Time's commercial performance deserves examination within historical context. 7.6 million sales on N64 is phenomenal, considering the platform sold only 33 million units globally. That's nearly 1 in 4 N64 owners buying Ocarina. Extraordinary attachment rate, indicating must-have status. The game launched with unprecedented demand. It received 3 times more pre-orders than any previous game, forcing retailers like Electronics Boutique to stop taking orders. The gold collector's edition cartridge became status symbol and collectible. In its first 3 weeks, the game sold 2.5 million copies, generating $150 million in US revenue alone, more than any Hollywood film released in late 1998. Critical reception matched commercial success. The game scored 99 on Metacritic, the highest-rated game in history, a record it still holds 27 years later. It received the first ever perfect 40 out of 40 from Famitsu, Japan's most respected gaming publication. It won Game of the Year awards across virtually every major publication. This wasn't just good reviews, it was universal consensus that Nintendo had created something transcendent. The game's success occurred despite N64's struggles against PlayStation. Sony's console dominated the generation, yet Ocarina of Time sold millions on weaker hardware with smaller install base. This proves that quality overcomes platform disadvantages. If the game is essential, players find ways to play it regardless of which console is winning. Long-tail sales extended success beyond launch. The 3DS remake sold an additional 6.44 million copies in 2011, proving the game's enduring appeal. Virtual console releases, GameCube ports, and ongoing availability mean new generations continue discovering Ocarina. Few games maintain commercial viability decades after initial release, but Ocarina remains an evergreen title that sells whenever Nintendo makes it available. Industry influence, the game that changed everything. The most significant measure of Ocarina of Time's impact isn't what it achieved, it's how it shaped everything that came after. Modern 3D action-adventure games exist in a design lineage directly descended from Ocarina's innovations. The fundamental grammar of 3D action gameplay, how we control characters, target enemies, navigate environments, solve puzzles, was written by this single game. Developers openly acknowledged the debt. Amy Hennig cited Ocarina's influence on Legacy of Kain and Uncharted. CD Projekt Red referenced it as inspiration for the Witcher series. Fumio Ueda credited Ocarina as influence on Shadow of the Colossus and Ico. From Software's entire catalog builds on Ocarina's Z-targeting foundation. When Rockstar created Grand Theft Auto 3, they internally described it as Zelda meets Goodfellas, using Ocarina as the template for 3D open-world action design.
The game established design conventions that became invisible through ubiquity. Lock-on targeting in any game? Ocarina. Context-sensitive action buttons? Ocarina. Hub areas connecting distinct dungeon locations? Ocarina. Day-night cycles affecting gameplay? Ocarina. Boss fights preceded by mini-boss battles testing specific mechanics? Ocarina. These aren't conscious homages, they're fundamental building blocks incorporated into design language. Ocarina proved 3D adventure games could match their 2D predecessors in depth, complexity, and satisfaction. Before Ocarina, many believed 3D was suitable for racing games and shooters, but couldn't handle adventure gaming's nuanced requirements. Ocarina demolished that assumption, showing that 3D enhanced rather than limited adventure design. This opened possibilities, giving developers confidence to pursue 3D adventure projects that would have seemed impossible before Ocarina proved they could work. The game also influenced narrative ambitions. Ocarina showed games could tell emotionally resonant stories without extensive cutscenes or compromising gameplay. The coming-of-age narrative, the bittersweet ending, the environmental storytelling, these raised standards for what game narratives could achieve. Developers saw that mechanical and narrative design could reinforce each other rather than existing in tension. Cultural phenomenon and lasting legacy. Beyond industry influence, Ocarina of Time achieved genuine cultural phenomenon status. It transcended gaming communities to become part of broader pop culture conversation. People who don't play games know Ocarina of Time by reputation. It's referenced in television, parodied in comedy, cited in academic game studies. The game became shorthand for gaming excellence, the title you mention when arguing games are art. In 2022, Ocarina of Time was inducted into the World Video Game Hall of Fame, only the second Zelda game to receive this honor after the original. The citation praised its freedom of movement in a three-dimensional world that felt expansive and vast, crediting it with laying the foundation not just for the action games that would follow it, but for the gaming industry as a whole. The game's music achieved independent cultural status. Ocarina songs are performed by orchestras, covered by musicians across genres, remixed and reinterpreted endlessly. The soundtrack exists as appreciated musical work separate from the game. How many video game soundtracks achieve this? Koji Kondo's compositions have genuine artistic recognition beyond their original context. Speedrunning communities keep Ocarina alive through competitive optimization. Players spend thousands of hours discovering new glitches, routing optimizations, and sequence breaks. The any% speedrun record continues breaking as new techniques emerge decades after release. This sustained competitive attention speaks to the depth of the game. There's still new things to discover after 27 years of intensive analysis. The game shaped childhoods and created memories that defined gaming for entire generations. For millions of players, Ocarina of Time wasn't just a game they played, it was a formative experience that influenced their relationship with the medium. The emotional connection people maintain to Ocarina decades later is profound and genuine, speaking to how effectively it combined technical achievement with emotional resonance. The perfect storm of excellence. Ocarina of Time succeeded because everything aligned perfectly. The technology was finally capable of realizing 3D adventure gaming without crippling compromises. The team had the talent, vision, and resources to solve unprecedented design challenges. Nintendo had the patience to delay release until everything worked flawlessly rather than rushing to market. The cultural moment was right. Audiences were ready for more ambitious gaming experiences. But success wasn't inevitable. Dozens of decisions could have gone wrong. If Z-targeting hadn't worked elegantly, combat would have been frustrating rather than satisfying. If dungeons had been poorly paced, exploration would have felt tedious. If the narrative hadn't resonated emotionally, the game would have been mechanically impressive but emotionally hollow. If the time travel structure had created confusion rather than depth, it would have undermined the entire experience. Nintendo got everything right. Not just right, but exemplary. They solved fundamental 3D gaming problems so thoroughly that solutions became invisible, absorbed into design language. They created a world that felt alive and meaningful. They told a story that resonated across cultures and age groups. They built dungeons that remain pinnacles of puzzle design. They composed music that transcended its original purpose to become genuinely artistic achievement. The game's legacy is secure not because of nostalgia, but because its design principles remain valid. Modern games still use Ocarina solutions to fundamental problems because those solutions work. You could release Ocarina of Time today with updated graphics, and the core gameplay would still feel excellent. That's remarkable. Most games age poorly as mechanics become obsolete, but Ocarina's mechanical foundations are timeless because they solved problems correctly the first time. The enduring question, will we ever see its equal? Here's the uncomfortable truth. We may never see another game with Ocarina of Time's level of transformative impact. Not because games can't achieve technical or artistic excellence, we see brilliant games regularly. But Ocarina existed at a unique historical moment when fundamental design problems still needed solving, and solving them correctly changed everything. Modern masterpieces, Breath of the Wild, The Witcher 3, Elden Ring, Red Dead Redemption 2, are incredible achievements, but they build on established foundations rather than laying new ones. They refine and perfect rather than revolutionize. They're evolution, not revolution. And that's not criticism. It's acknowledgement that the foundational work has already been done, largely by games like Ocarina. For a game to match Ocarina of Time's impact today, it would need to solve problems we don't yet know how to solve, prove something we believe impossible, and establish design principles that inform the next 25 years of game development. Maybe virtual reality will produce such a game. Maybe some technological breakthrough we haven't imagined will create new design spaces requiring fundamentally new solutions. But until then, Ocarina of Time remains the standard. Not just a great game, but the game that showed us what games could be. That's the retrospective on Ocarina of Time. Not just why it succeeded, but why its success mattered more than commercial performance or critical acclaim. It changed gaming's trajectory, proved what the medium could achieve, and established design principles that define how we play today. 27 years later, its influence is so pervasive that we barely notice it. And that ubiquity is the ultimate testament to its revolutionary achievement. The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time isn't just the highest-rated game ever made, it's the foundation upon which modern gaming stands, the moment when potential became reality, and the proof that video games could be art, adventure, and innovation combined into something transcendent. That's why it endures. That's why it matters. And that's why decades from now, we'll still be measuring games against the standard it set on a November day in 1998 when everything changed.